Well, it's my pleasure once again to welcome you to the Reed and Christine Halliday Executive Lecture Series. As you well know already, a lot of the speakers come from fairly close to home, and we've had a lot of great speakers who do that. Every once in a while, we're fortunate to bring someone in from a 4 or 5 hour plane ride away, and that's the case today, and so maybe it makes today just a little extra special. But I'd like to introduce you to Robert Simmons. Robert has deep experience in managing growth-oriented companies. He is currently a partner at Bendigo Partners, a New York-based private investment and consulting firm focused on disruptive technologies in financial services. Prior to helping found Bendigo in 2009, he served as chief financial officer of a little company you may have heard of as E-Trade Financial, where he helped engineer the company's profit increase from a loss of $250 million in 2001 to annual profits of over $600 million pre-global credit crisis. Revenue doubled over that time from $1.2 billion to $2.4 billion annually. Robert was also part of the record growth of Oracle Corporation, Iomega Corporation, and Campus Pipeline in a variety of corporate finance-related roles after starting his career with Bank of America as a lending officer, so from fairly humble beginnings to loftier heights, perhaps. He has been interviewed as an industry and topical expert by various print and broadcast media, including appearances on CNBC Squawk Box and in the Wall Street Journal. He received an MBA from Northwestern University, the Kellogg Graduate School of Management. For those of you who have not looked into graduate degrees so far, it's a great school. He also received his bachelor's degree magna cum laude from BYU from the Marriott School. He's former chairman and board member of the Association for Financial Professionals and is proficient in Italian, molto bene, but also is a member of our National Advisory Council starting now. So anyway, please join me in welcoming Robert Simmons.
Well, it's great to be here today. It took 20 years for me to get a visa to be able to visit UVU after my BYU background, but it's great to be here, and it's great to be involved in the great growth of the business school going forward. I became acquainted with Matt Holland through a friend of a friend, and a former neighbor of mine, Scott Paul, who's up there at the top and who's about to leave soon. But Matt laid out for me his vision of what he'd like to do with UVU going forward, and I bought in a big way. And so I agreed to be on the National Advisory Council for the business school, and I'm really happy to be here today. I was right where you guys were not that long ago, and so I remember what it's like, and I know that it's kind of lunchtime, but please, if I say something today that makes no sense to you, like, stop me. Say, hey, wait a minute, that sounds crazy. I don't mind. I was with you guys, so I'm going to talk about a lot of different things today. I'm going to be general in some things, and I'm going to be technical in some things for those of you that are more advanced down the finance track. So anyway, I hope it'll be interesting. How many of you watched the debate last night? Yeah. I didn't watch it live, but I did listen to the replay of it. But it was really interesting because there's a lot of interesting problems that happens when the government gets too involved in business. And as someone who's been on the front line, and as people who will be on the front line like you, you'll see it happening. One of the things that someone made reference to last night had to do with Dodd-Frank. And the Dodd-Frank was the regulation that came in post the global credit crisis that was supposed to be the thing that was going to save us from this stuff ever happening again. But there's lots of unintended consequences whenever the government gets too involved in business. And one of these is interesting because it was part of my talk already, and so when Governor Romney and President Obama made reference to this, I thought this is perfect. It's like more material for my speech tomorrow. But basically, this whole too big to fail concept, you guys understand what that is? Too big to fail, meaning that there's a certain number of banks. Some say there's 5. I think Governor Romney said there were 5 banks that are too big to fail. Some people put the number more like 20. But what that's code for is that the government is going to provide a de facto guarantee to these banks. So what does that mean? If the government's going to give a de facto guarantee to these banks, it's really easy for them to go raise capital. And it's not only easy, it's cheap. And so what happens is, the unintended consequence of this is that you're providing effectively an economic subsidy by the government to the banks that need it the least, right? The banks that need it the most are the regional banks, the local banks, the community banks that are here. Those are the ones that are doing the real lending that creates the real jobs and creates, the businesses that you guys are going to someday work for. So anyway, I just thought it was interesting that, good timing for this speech that we're talking about all this stuff at really a national level. So one of the things, like my thesis for today, so if you're going to title your notes for this speech, I don't know if you have to take notes or if you have to turn anything in about this, but my thesis for today that I want to introduce is the thing that the USA, that America, does better than anybody else in the world is that we take ideas and capital and we put them together. We don't necessarily have the best engineers in the world, right? We still have, plenty of issues with how we're allocating our own resources. We have plenty of issues with our deficits and everything. But our economy is so robust that even the politicians can't seem to screw it up permanently. It always seems to bounce back. So the thing that is the most interesting thing about the United States is that you take ideas and you take capital and you create these opportunities that are unprecedented in the world. And so one of the things I want to talk to you guys about today a little bit is that you need to think about yourselves in maybe those two terms very broadly. Am I an idea person? Am I the sort of person that either as an entrepreneur or within a company, am I going to be the one that's going to have these great ideas that's going to help America stay great? Or am I going to be a capital person? Am I going to be the one that's going to recognize great ideas and help fund them? Either, again, as a venture capitalist, as someone within a corporation that's making a decision about how to allocate capital. But think of yourselves in one of those two buckets or in both of those buckets, because I think it's helpful. So let's talk about good ideas. Apple, pretty darn good idea, right? It had plenty of funding. Steve Jobs, the whole story with Steve Jobs, they never had any problems, except for a few years raising capital for great ideas there, and now suddenly it's the most valuable company in the world. So bad idea is a 2,000-pound hamburger, probably in the category of what you want to stay away from. Good idea, Google. Great idea. Let's index all the knowledge of the world and make it available to people. Bad idea, don't do this at home, please. 331,000 Bs on yourself is not a good idea. And the clicker's not working. Good idea, Utah Valley University. Bad idea, 453 piercings on your face, okay? So for context, you can see where you want to focus. So let me talk a little bit about engineers in general. Because I think this is one of the interesting things. You hear politicians talk about it sometimes. We could use more and better engineers in this country, but at least as a country and as an economy, we've been smart enough to recognize that when we need access to other talent, whether it's capital talent or individual talent, that we go find it wherever it exists in the world. If anyone thinks that our politicians are doing anybody a favor by criticizing that process, I would argue that that's really a mistaken concept, that giving U.S. companies access to global capital, whether that's human capital or whether that's actual money, that's an important part of our growth story as an economy too. So why do U.S. companies in particular have to go abroad for jobs? Why does General Electric, for instance, have jobs all over the country for what they do? Well, one of the things that's interesting is, and I looked these stats up to make sure they were still current, but in the U.S. we still have 8.5 liberal arts majors for every one engineering major that we graduate in this country. In the U.S., we have more art majors than engineering majors. In the U.S., we have 4 times more business majors than we have engineering majors. And that's not a criticism, that's just the facts. There's 4 times more of you than there are engineering students around the country. In the US, we only graduate 16% of our college students with a degree that's in any of the fields related to science, math, or engineering. The rest of the world, that number's about 23%. So we're a little bit less. So let's think about that for a minute. So with those stats being that horrible against us, why haven't we already lost the battle? I mean, why is it that Facebook and Apple and Google and all those great concepts are being invented here and not somewhere else that does a better job, educating students in engineering? Because it's not just about engineering, is the answer to the question. That's one of the means to the end, but it's about bringing ideas together with capital that America does better than anybody else. That's why we haven't lost the battle. That's why Apple exists here and not in India. So, and there's by no means a lot of consensus around this. Like, let's take two of our most venerated names in the world of business and science, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Very different views on education and how that should work. Bill Gates is very pro targeting investment in science and engineering. He thinks that there should be 8.5 engineers for every one liberal arts major. Now, Steve Jobs, as you know, he was an amazing guy that had a broad education. He was very pro-liberal arts. He loved studying arts. He loved studying graphic design. I mean, how can anyone miss like the packaging that Apple has in their products? It's like Steve Jobs written all over it. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous design, and it's one of the reasons that they've been successful. But without all the engineering knowledge in the world is useless without creative applications for that knowledge. On the other hand, you can't apply anything creatively that you don't have the difficult, tedious, and unglamorous technical knowledge to be able to build and design and engineer. So I think ideally where we would come out is a balanced approach between how Bill Gates views the world of education and how Steve Jobs views the world of education. I think in general, the US could probably do with more engineering talent. As someone who's been a business leader, I can tell you that it's not always easy to recruit the sort of people that you want, and that's why sometimes you do go to places like India or the Philippines or Vietnam for engineering talent. I mean, it's the reality of the world. So, okay, so let me talk a little bit about, where is the next Steve Jobs going to come from? Unfortunately, we lost Steve last year. Where's the next one going to come from, and what made him special? Because he wasn't a particularly brilliant engineer. I mean, he had an engineering background of sorts, but he was very broad in his background. But he had an amazing sense of what people would want, even before they knew what they would want. He had a beautiful sense of design aesthetic, but most importantly, he could recognize a good idea, whether it was his idea or whether it was an idea that someone else had, either within his organization or outside his organization. He could recognize that as a good idea, and he would help allocate capital to build and commercialize that idea. He was technical enough to bridge the engineers and the marketeers and make them both angry, but somehow making the product that emerges as a result of that conflict between engineering and marketing, and come up with these amazing products that we know as the iPod, iPad, iMac, etc. So I just want to drill into this whole concept a little bit about ideas and capital. And I want to start first about ideas. So we've already talked a little bit about Apple and Google and Facebook and how they were incredibly innovative, developing commercial products that didn't even exist 10 years ago. Are there more ideas like that are going to be coming out in the next 10 years that no one's thought of right now? I sure hope so. I mean, that's what's going to keep America great, and that's what's going to create the jobs that you guys are going to be sitting in. So let me talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I have been personally involved with on the idea front. The first one is the E-Trade Baby. How many of you have ever seen an E-Trade Baby ad? Good. Look at that. Well, the story with the E-Trade, as I was introduced, I was the former CFO of E-Trade. But E-Trade was really an interesting kind of story about disruption and certain things that that happened that, E-Trade sprang into existence by doing something like an order of magnitude better than had ever been done before, meaning cheaper. Meaning we had taken, what had been it used to cost $600 or $700 to do a stock trade, and we suddenly started offering being able to do that for $20. So originally, like people like Merrill Lynch criticized. I said, "Oh, that's a discount brokerage." It's like, yeah, you can get a cheap trade there, but you can't get any service. You can't talk to your broker. You can't get the full suite of information that's around there. Well, actually, you can. You can get almost everything now in terms of research access, via the electronic means. It was a very, very disruptive slide. But the one thing that's kind of interesting is, great ideas are important not only for entrepreneurs that are going to start new companies and bring new ideas to market, but it's really important for all companies to have great ideas. How many of you remember the company called Kodak? Remember Kodak? Like Kodak was, in the Dow Jones Industrial Average for decades. Like they invented photography. They were the powerhouse in photography. But when digital photography came along, they couldn't figure out how to survive in a digital photography world. And where's Kodak today? Does anybody know? I mean, they're auctioning off their IP, their intellectual property. I mean, Kodak's basically in the dust heap now of history. It's amazing. Like this was a Kodak that we all knew and loved for years, right? So that was an example of a company that was not able to take lots of good ideas that were out there, recognize them for what they were, and allocate capital to them. They continued to allocate capital to old ideas that may have made sense in an Excel spreadsheet somewhere for a board somewhere, but these were not ideas that were going to keep them alive for now. And in fact, going into the next century, they're gone. So let me talk a little bit about E-Trade, because there's a kind of interesting story here. When the global credit crisis hit, starting in 2007 and really in 2008, when Bear Stearns and Lehman went under, I was working at E-Trade then. We had a $60 billion balance sheet that was full of mortgage paper that was now under fire. We actually had a time when we had a mini run on our bank. Like people, we had billions of dollars of deposits that were leaving our bank every month for a few months there in late 2007. So we were faced with a kind of an interesting dilemma. Some of the banks took the approach of, we're going to go out to the market in our advertising, and we're going to have pictures of big, strong Greek pillars, and we're going to emphasize our strength and our soundness for people, because we think that's what people want to hear. And we realized at E-Trade that there was no way that we were going to be able to compete with someone like a Citibank or whatever on that front in terms of marketing. So we went completely the other direction. Instead of emphasizing granite pillars, we invented the E-Trade baby. We made it fun. People had enough of depressed, and so we went out there and talked about the E-Trade baby and how it's still fun to trade and how it's still a great way to protect your portfolio was doing your own research and making your own decisions, and it was made all the difference. Like literally the run on the bank ended almost overnight. As soon as we ran that campaign, we were in the Super Bowl, we ran a Super Bowl ad, and all of a sudden E-Trade was back alive and well again. But some of the disruptive things, I'll just give a quick list. We already talked about electronic trading when Merrill was charging $600 a trade. All of a sudden E-Trade came out and we were charging $20 a trade. We gave people electronic access to their full spectrum of financial information. That had never been available. You had to wait for your statement to come in the mail. I know it sounds very primitive now. The portable mortgage product. E-Trade invented a portable mortgage, not invented, but a portable mortgage is kind of a cool concept where you get a mortgage, you get a loan from a bank against a house, and then if you decide to move from that house, you actually take the mortgage with you. Well, guess what? They do this all the time in the UK, and it works great. So if you have a rate that you like and you want to move to a different house, you take your mortgage with you. If you're getting a more expensive house, you might have to throw some more money in. But portable mortgages is something that still, for some reason, has not caught on in the US, even though all over Europe, the portability of mortgage is very popular, especially in an environment like we have now where rates are so low. blows my mind that portable mortgages aren't more popular. The concept of all ATMs being free ATMs, like being able to rebate your ATM, that was a big deal where banks used to advertise, we have 500 ATMs in the New York metro area. Well, E-Trade made it irrelevant because it didn't matter if it was an E-Trade ATM or a Citibank ATM or a Chase ATM. All of those ATMs were free, and we would rebate you that. This is just examples of ideas that were little mini disruptors, ones that other banks couldn't match. We knew that they couldn't match it because the economics wouldn't work for them. We had something called the 12B1 fee rebate. Now, this is like technical stuff, but think of it, if you own a mutual fund, like with Fidelity, Fidelity pays the broker, E-Trade or Schwab or whoever, they pay them a fee every year just for having your account own one of their mutual funds. They're called 12B1 fees. I mean, none of you probably even knew that there was such a thing, right? Nobody does. So we looked at people like Schwab who had this massive franchise in mutual funds. That's like a big chunk of their profitability in their business comes from mutual funds, and the actual way that they monetize a mutual fund, if you buy a mutual fund at Schwab, it's through these back-end fees, these 12B1 fees that come from the fund family. So we came up with an idea that, hey, we're going to give back half of this fee that we're getting from the fund families, and we're going to give it back to the customer so that you can own the exact same fund from Fidelity at Schwab or at E-Trade, and you're going to have a higher yield on that fund at E-Trade. Interesting new concept. Very disruptive, very interesting stuff. IPO shares. How many know what an IPO is? Initial public offering, right? So very tough to get 10 years ago if you were just a retail investor. This was the domain of the institutional guys. The fund managers got all the access to the IPO shares. Well, E-Trade and other of the online players suddenly started making IPO shares available to retail. And, for good and bad, right? Like the Facebook IPO, like had a big chunk of retail, even though the stock has not performed well on that. Another disruptive idea that I was just working on last week has to do with something that you all presumably love, and that's Facebook. Do you guys still use Facebook, or is Facebook now kind of passé? All right, so it's good. Facebook's kind of a cool thing. I use it still, but we've been working on something at one of the portfolio companies at my company, a company called Capital. It's a company that we have an investment in, but it's called the Social Index. And this is actually, it's going to be introduced, I think actually tomorrow or later this week in Wired, so you're kind of getting a preview here. But we figured out at Capital how to measure the amount of likes, when you press like, for the biggest companies in the world. Like all the companies, all the biggest companies in the US are now on Facebook pretty much. They have some sort of a presence on Facebook. So we found a way to measure how many of those companies are getting likes, and then we turned it into an index. So the idea being that if somebody cares enough about, General Electric or something, to go to their Facebook page and press like for some reason, that's an interesting indicator of future behavior, that they're going to be more likely to be a customer, they're going to buy General Electric stuff. And so we went in there and did some work, applied our statistics training, and did some correlation analysis. So it's kind of interesting. So the theory is that people's online activities are potentially a leading indicator of kind of economic things that they plan to do in the future. So we took a look over the last 12 months and looked at the top 9 companies that were getting likes, and tracked it against their stock performance, and found that of 7 of the 9, that their stock performance was highly correlated, meaning R-squareds of 80% or better against their online social activity. So it's a social index. So this is a sort of innovative new information that companies are putting out there to make the investors have a different way to look at life and potentially measure and predict future stock performance. So all these are kind of interesting examples of interesting ideas that I've been involved with. There's obviously millions of others that are even way better than any of those. But watch the world around you. It's like all of you can have great ideas. You know, think about things that are inconvenient for you and think about ways that you can make, you know, things more convenient. And that is potentially an idea. That's potentially a business. If your idea is really big, I mean, if you have a big idea and you're working for a company, take it to your boss. You know, if you have an idea that's really big, then quit your job and then call me. I'll leave my number for you and we'll work on it together. But I think if you think in terms of cost, functionality, and convenience, those are some of the key ways where you can find ways that ideas can turn into businesses that can eventually turn into job-producing enterprises to help keep America great. You know, the key to keeping America great is to continue to have these great ideas that are emerging from this incredibly creative group that I've got here in front of me today. So keep it going. Okay, so that's the idea side. So let's talk a little bit about capital now. So we've established that America's competitive advantage is in its ability to bring ideas and capital together in kind of an explosive way. So let's talk about that. Specifically, I want to hit on a couple of innovations that are out there in capital raising. So working on the capital side to fund ideas, whether you're funding a startup or working within a multinational corporation, the concept effectively is the same. It doesn't really matter. It's both very helpful. You're helping capital to flow to the best ideas that are going to be generating the best return on risk-adjusted capital. So this is not a game that we're in for sport or for charity. This is to generate a great return on capital. That's how we create real jobs. And we're going to try to get paid appropriately for taking the appropriate amount of risk. And surprisingly enough, this is something that companies don't always do well. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with how the capital markets work in general, so I'm not going to talk so much about the debt markets or the equity markets in general, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the innovations that are out there, some of the changes that are coming either through regulation or other things that are out there. So obviously there's a huge spectrum of structures that are out there that comprise our capital markets. You can start on the very low end with things like crowdfunding. You've got angel networks that are helping start startups. You've got venture capital, hedge funds, private equity firms, mutual funds, banks, lenders, alternative lenders, commercial finance companies, leasing companies. All of these are fundamentally providing capital to help fund ideas or help fund businesses. So let me touch on a couple that are new or things are changing a lot or they're innovative. The first is crowdfunding. Has anyone heard of crowdfunding? Couple. Good. Excellent. Well, crowdfunding is one of those things, again, where it's helping solve one of the unintended consequences of government regulation. And one of the things under Reg D that the government has made hard for young companies, pre-public companies, it's hard for them to raise capital from non-accredited investors. And non-accredited is basically code for normal, middle-class people, right? Accredited investors are wealthy investors. It's easy to raise money from accredited investors. But under Reg D, the government made it challenging, thinking they were protecting the little guy, thinking that they were protecting the middle class from, investing their money unwisely. But what that's meant is that some of the best opportunities, the best returns, again, are locked out for the people that need it the most, right? The middle class is who needs the best return on their investment. And it's been locked away. The Jobs Act of 2012, which I think passed in about May of this year, and it passed like overwhelmingly with bipartisan support. I think the Senate vote was something like 86-12 or something. It's not something that happens very often in Washington that an initiative gets so much bipartisan support. But this Jobs Act of 2012 created, among other things, a structure, a regulatory construct where crowdfunding could happen. So essentially, quickly, it allows private companies to raise up to $1 million in any 12-month period from small, non-accredited investors. So the old Reg D rules formerly limited your investors to 99 individuals. It expanded the number of individuals you can have before you go public and before you're required to have the additional disclosure requirements that basically make you a public company at that point. Even if your stock isn't publicly traded, you're required to have the disclosures very similar to what you would have to do if you were a public company, meaning quarterly disclosures of financial statements. Non-accredited investors are limited under this act to only a small percentage of their annual income, 5% of their annual income, or 10% if they've got annual income of over $100,000 and assets of $100,000. So this is a new, interesting way for people to invest not only in new companies and new ideas, but causes. So crowdfunding has been applied to a number of things. Like if you were particularly interested in the environment and you wanted to invest in new, like green technology, you knew of some new battery company or something that was coming up with a new way to create a new product, you would have the ability to invest early stage in that company, and the company is going to be able to fund these new innovative ideas in a way that's easier and theoretically cheaper than they've ever been able to do before. Any of you that are familiar with the venture world know that the venture capital firms do a great job of finding great ideas, but man, do they ever take their pound of flesh. They come in and they get a lot of, they take a lot of ownership, they take a lot of preference rights away from the owners of that company that it's part of the trade-off of making their capital available to them. So crowdfunding is another way to make things easier for capital to flow to new ideas. The second one has to do with kind of more unintended consequences of government regulation. But before I go into that any further, I want to tell a little story. So in 1988, Yellowstone National Park, not too far from here, experienced one of the largest forest fires in U.S. history. Yellowstone had been really overgrown, and everybody knew, like the experts knew, that they were way overdue for a big fire. So up until that point, they'd been taking this approach of, we're going to do little controlled burns all over the place to try to control things. But in 1988, their controlled burns all got out of control. They merged, and all of a sudden, they had a fire that burned literally for several months. I mean, this was a big disaster. It was widely reported in the media, and it affected something like 800,000 acres of the park, or about 36% of the park was burned to some degree. Of course, the media ran with this thing, as they always do, and reporting that things are never going to be the same in Yellowstone. It's devastating. And anyway, I hope that you can see that there's an analogy kind of forming here. So this was fall of 1988 when this fire hit. Well, guess what? Spring of 1989 came, and there was the most glorious display of wildfires that had ever been seen at the park. So out of the devastation of 1988 came the rebirth and the hope in the spring of 1989 that, okay, maybe things aren't quite as bad as the media was trying to tell us a few months ago. Maybe there is hope that this is, that some of these beautiful forests are going to be able to regrow. Well, in 2007 and 2008, our economy had its own massive wildfire. It burned for months, and it put some legendary names, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, others, into the ash heap of history. Of course, the media picked up on this, and they ran with this just like they always do, and reported that things are never going to be the same in the U.S. again, just like they did with Yellowstone. Things are never going to be the same for the world economy. But just like in Yellowstone and for our economy, out of the devastation will come rebirth and hope. Our economic forest hasn't completely regrown, obviously, but we are starting to see some fairly impressive wildflowers blooming. Let's talk about that. Let's start with the stock market. So, S&P 500 ended December 2007 right around 1,400. Where is it now? Right about 1,400. We're back. NASDAQ went from 2674 in December 2007. It's over 3,100 today. So I was driving in. Dow Jones Industrial Average was at 12,800. It's now over 13,400. So what's the lesson here? Our economy, as in Yellowstone, is so robust that even our politicians can't screw it up permanently. We'll have our fires from time to time, and it's actually healthy, believe it or not. But if we keep doing what we do best, that's matching good ideas with capital, if we can keep doing that better than anybody else in the world, we're going to be fine. So let me give you a quick other example of a post-credit crisis wildflower that's a small fund that's right here in your backyard, a guy based out of Salt Lake. I happen to sit on the board of this fund. That's why I know the story, to be able to tell it, and I'm an investor in this fund, so I've provided my full disclosure now. But when the global credit crisis hit in 2007 and 2008, like we talked about up front, Dodd-Frank made it very difficult for banks. Like, they didn't like banks doing certain types of lending. Certain types of lending they just stopped doing altogether. One of those types of lending, ironically, had to do with housing. And so people that wanted a new house, they had builders that were willing to build the house for them. They had the money. They might have even had the mortgage approved, which isn't as easy as it used to be. But guess what? The banks, the local banks, the community banks that formerly were the ones that were lending to these real estate developers, they can't. Their federal regulator won't allow them to. Well, they can, but they have to keep massive amounts of capital against these sort of loans. So the sort of relationship lending they used to do, to someone who's maybe been a 20-year developer, has a great balance sheet, but doesn't want to put his home up as collateral against a project, he's out of luck. There's no bank that's going to come in and lend to him now. So a guy I know named Mark Taylor went and raised some money, had a great idea, found the capital flowed to the idea, and he's now an alternate lender that's doing lending to real estate developers on a pre-construction basis. His fund is growing over 100% a year right now, and it has for the last 3 years. I was just in New York with him raising money last week. And, a great example of a guy who found a need in the economy and now can turn that into a great return for investors. So he's doing loans that are fully secured, fully collateralized, loan-to-value loans of 60% on average across his portfolio, meaning that if he's got a property that he thinks he can sell for $100, he'll loan $60 against it, and then he'll go out and charge what's a pretty high interest rate, something in the 14, 15, 16% rate to that developer, because there are literally no other alternatives out there because of the unintended consequences of government regulation. My father spent his whole career as a banker in a community bank doing exactly this sort of relationship lending, where he'd know these guys, they'd go play golf together, he knew what their business was doing, he knew when it was safe to lend to them, he knew when they had great business prospects. And my dad hardly ever had a loan go bad on him because he knew his lender. He knew the borrower. And these days, it doesn't matter. Banks can't do it because of federal regulation. So anyway, it's an example. Mountain West Debt Fund is a small fund that's here. That's an interesting example in your backyard here of how good ideas and capital can flow together to meet an economic need. And ultimately, in this case, create jobs, literally, right? Because now these developers can hire people to build these houses, people like you. When you go out and get your jobs, you can buy these houses and have the nice new home that you dreamed about. Thanks to guys like Mark Taylor, the American dream of owning your own home is still alive and well. Despite all you read about America now becoming a renter society, how it's it doesn't make sense for people to own their own homes anymore, I say baloney to all that. So let me talk a little bit about being a CFO, because it's possible that some of you will end up being CFOs someday as business school students. I know I've focused a lot on kind of entrepreneurial type things like venture capital, new ideas that are creating new companies. But these concepts are every bit as important for a big company. And in fact, I would posit for you today that the most important job of a chief financial officer of a company doesn't have anything to do with accounting or controls or any of that stuff. It has to do with making sure that capital, which is the domain of the CFO, right? The balance sheet is owned by the CFO generally, making sure that capital is being allocated to the best ideas in a company so that things like Kodak doesn't happen again. So that's important that you guys think of yourselves in that way as future CFOs in there, because this is what's going to keep America being great. We don't want companies like Kodak to go out of business and lay off 100,000 plus workers in the Rochester, New York area like they've had to do. We don't want that. We want them to be innovative. We want them to be disruptive. We want them to be the ones that are investing in new technologies. You know, it can't just be the burden or the domain of the entrepreneur that this happens. So the way that as a CFO that you can pull this off and make this happen is to understand the concept of risk. Because when you learn in business school about discounted cash flows and net present values, you know, you're taking a future stream of cash flows and you're discounting it by some discount rate, right? Most companies think of it as, what is my cost of capital? And they'll discount that by their cost of capital. Well, that's not far enough in the real world. Because what you really need to do is look at the project, either project by project, whether it's an acquisition that you're doing, whether it's an opportunity to invest in a new product, or whether it's a decision whether to shutter an entire division. You need to look at the return on capital on a risk-adjusted basis. So if a company, for instance, wants to come and get into a brand new line of business, they have no expertise in this, that's a higher risk prospect than rolling out, you know, version 5.0 of an existing product line. So that would make sense then that there's a higher risk adjustment placed on the cost of capital on the discount rate that's being used to discount the future cash flows of that company. This concept of risk adjusting, it's amazing that not many companies I've ever seen actually have formalized this process. Some have, and some do a great job of it. I think GE is one that's done a great job of kind of going to the next level. But this is actually a real-world example of one of the companies I worked for of where I kind of laid this out. Where you look at a project risk, I laid it out on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being super low risk, like the decision, do I want to buy a new employee a computer? It's like, yeah, that's pretty low risk, we understand that pretty well, so there's going to be a very low risk associated with that, and thus a very low cost of capital attributed to that. Versus, we want to do an acquisition of a company that's in a completely different line of business from us. That would be an example of a high risk return situation where you'd have a discounting that would be much higher for that. So think of this as an opportunity to apply these same concepts to help capital flow to the appropriate projects, but within the construct of a big company, though. It's just as important for a big company as it is for an entrepreneur. So the idea of risk adjusting your future cash flows is very important. I know I'm almost out of time, but this is an example, a real-world example of a company that had 2 divisions and then kind of a third group of other businesses. So they looked at the capital that had been attributed to each division, you know, $736 million in the case of the first division, looked at its risk level, which was kind of the average level risk for the company, so that was a 3. And the minimum required return in that case would have been 15%. So for purposes of planning, whether this division should exist or whether there needed to be additional work done on that, you could see that if it wasn't returning at least $110 million on that $736 million of capital that had been allocated to it, that something's wrong and that it's actually taking value away from the overall enterprise and the shareholders of that enterprise. So I'm going to skip this thing, but basically just, this is the idea of there's, when you look at the cost of capital within a company, it's important to not forget the market. It's important to not just look at the overall historical cost of capital of a company for purposes of discounting cash flows. So in this case, this is an example of a company that went out and incrementally raised a convertible note, and then which represented cost of incremental capital. So to the extent they wanted to invest in a new business and they needed to go outside the company to raise the capital of the business, this is how you would create a market. This is how you would calculate a market rate for that. But anyway, in conclusion, I just have 5 points that I want to make. Number one, help keep America great. You know, help our economy to keep pairing great ideas with the capital that's required to commercialize them. Number two, think of yourself as an idea person or a capital person or both, whether in the construct of it being an entrepreneur or whether you're working in a large multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation. Number three, recognize economic forest fires for what they are, and don't forget to watch for the wildflowers to bloom in the spring. Number four, the tools you learn here at business school, like discounted cash flows, IRR, NPV, capital asset pricing model, they're all going to help you help our economy allocate capital efficiently based on risk-adjusted cash flows of investment opportunities. This is how real jobs are created in an economy, not by government bureaucrats. Number five, stay optimistic. This is still the greatest country and the greatest economy on the planet. Thank you very much.
Looks like we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. Do we have some questions out there? There's one over there.
Obviously, we know that you went to go for quite a while. We also know what you're talking about. And not to get too political or anything, but after the debate and my work broke up, what is the best way, in your opinion, to create those jobs? So you summarized it pretty quick, but for students like us, for our children, like, how do you create those jobs? Because these ideas are fantastic, but how do you do that?
Well, I think there's 2 things that question lives in the domain of, like, political philosophy and then economic reality. The economic reality that I've lived is that every time the government comes in, like with Dodd-Frank, they do it for good reasons. They come in with good intentions, but there's always unintended negative consequences from it. And so the lesson is to be learned there is, like, if on the scale of doing less or more, it's like maybe for a change, government ought to look at maybe doing a little less than they have sometimes, just because the economy itself, in general, will do a really good job of allocating capital and allocating risk. That's what investors do best. Anytime that the government comes in and creates these externalities that lay over that, it creates inefficiencies that sometimes hurt us in things like jobs, and I think we've seen some of that. Not to be political.
That's a very well-worded answer. I know we've got a couple more questions out there, but obviously people are going to their next classes, and we are out of time. So let's give Rob Simmons a big hand of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.